Saadia, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. How are you?
Walaikum assalam. I'm doing great. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. This is great. And I'm really, I've got to say, I'm so proud of the work you're doing. These are really important conversations.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's good to hear that. And so I know that you have got a lot to share. Please introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself. I know you're very multifaceted.
Yeah. Well, wow, where would I start? I guess I married quite young and I was in university and I did a double master's in history and political science with a minor in psychology. After that, I did a master's in history and political science. Again, kept a couple of psychology courses on the side, but somehow was able to connect them to international law. So I was given permission and been straddling those worlds ever since. So for most of my career, I've been a teacher. I'm still teaching. I love it. I now teach online since COVID. But at the same time, I've always been quite active in the Muslim community in various capacities. I've led halakas. I've been involved in activism, particularly around the Iraq War. And I've done volunteer work and different charity efforts and sort of always had that going as well. And interestingly, a couple of years ago after my divorce, I started a support group for Muslim women who had gone through divorce out of my home, and it became incredibly popular. So initially, we had about 5 to 10 women meeting regularly, then 20. Then I had to start implementing wait lists as word grew. And it wasn't just divorced women, it was women who were considering divorce. And it became this sort of like safe, intimate space. Like we used to light candles and have tea and for women to talk about their experiences. And what I realized is we're sorely lacking a safe space in our communities for these conversations to occur. And especially with the lens that we employ as Muslims, because of course, therapy has been around for a really long time, but I can't tell you the number of women who have told me now that Western therapeutic approaches were not sufficient for them. Like it wasn't working because they brought such an Islamic worldview. And it's almost like either they had to leave that at the door or they had to go in and talk to the therapist and teach them about Islam. And then that would take the session. So we wouldn't quite get to the part where we're receiving support. So I understood that, but then I got remarried and I thought to
If I
myself,
might interject on the point of the
yeah,
divorce.
go ahead.
I didn't know you had this divorce group. So,
Yeah.
I guess what I wanted to say first is how it's so necessary because I find that in our societies, people are uncomfortable dealing with unpleasant things such as divorce. So I found that there were most of the time two categories, either the people who just pretended that nothing happened, or the people who would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'll make dua for you,"
Yes.
which is fine, but it's lacking. And I've read information that says that healing takes place with another person, like with somebody just witnessing you, then that's how healing can take place. Like if somebody can just offer that space and say, you are allowed to cry. It is okay to be in pain. And to just allow that to unfold, that in itself is so therapeutic. So I'm curious about this divorce group that you had. What what sparked it? Like, did you feel that you had something to share, or was it through your grief or your challenge? I want to know more about what, i.e., what motivated it, and then also what skills did you feel you had to be able to facilitate such a space?
Yeah. So I was working at an Islamic school then, and I was, like I said, I was quite active in the community. I'd just gone through my own divorce. It was difficult. It was brutal, in fact. I was shattered. But the thing is, I had a lot of family support. And what I realize as I've been doing this work is many women don't. Even with my family being so supportive, though, there were gaps. So, you just mentioned how a lot of women are expected not to talk about it, to sort of brush it under the carpet, to move on. I was advised the same. Um, I remember a family gathering with like extended family where somebody asked me, so where's your husband? And I said, actually, we're getting a divorce. And the whole room sort of stopped. And, I was looked at all of a sudden as if I had died or something, like something so horrific and tragic had happened to me. And I was doing okay by that point. So I understood also the stigma of talking about these things openly. And I understood that most women just don't talk about these things publicly and just move on quietly. But that's a very lonely experience. It's a very alienating experience. And like you said, healing occurs in the context of other relationships and feeling seen and seeing that and feeling validated and feeling loved despite this thing that happened to you. And so I went through all those stages myself. So I could understand when a woman was telling me how she felt. And many of these women were actually in situations that had been far worse than mine. So I just thought it's a good idea now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put me in a position of strength that I reach out and help my sisters up who don't necessarily have the familiar support that I had. Now, it was meant to be like a small thing. So initially, a couple women talked to me behind the scenes. They're like, well, actually, I was wondering about your perspective on this. I'm in an abusive situation, or I'm wondering what you think. I'm thinking of filing for divorce. So it was sort of these informal conversations. And I was like, if I'm doing this anyway, where I'm taking time out, I might as well form a group. Um, I I met with a lot of support for that, like, but I also met with criticism. Like people messaged me and said, "Don't you think you're sort of encouraging divorce with something like this?" And I was like, "No," and I don't see how, and that nobody could ever give me an answer. So, that happened quietly. It got way too big for me to manage, and around the same time, I decided to remarry. You asked what I thought my qualifications were. Like I really just, I think, was a person that people wanted to talk to, and they found me safe and a good listener, and sort of that they could hear bits and pieces of themselves in my story. And I was willing to share that story. So really it was just like, okay, well, we don't have a lot of other options, so let's go ahead and talk to you about it. And then that became a sort of like very supportive, synergistic environment. It was healing for me too, by the way, to be able to talk to other people, people who had gone through what I'd gone through, because nobody in my family had ever gone through divorce, and to bond with other women over our shared pain and our shared resilience. That so it wasn't like a one-sided thing where I'm just helping other people. It actually helped me a lot as well. And then I did have a second master's degree in education. And I think some of the tools and techniques you learn um, in education is that you can pretty much learn anything and teach it. So I started like devouring material on divorce recovery and support, and trying to look for, um, the Islamic position and what scholars had to say, especially early scholars. And they had a lot to say. And I started integrating these things. So while it was a support group, I always had sort of like a 10-minute talk based on what I had found through my own learning. And I thought it was useful then to share, whatever insights I gained from that with the group. And people loved that. So when I disbanded, I got remarried and I disbanded the group. But interestingly, when COVID happened, I started getting a lot of calls. One of the things COVID did is it put a lot of marriages under pressure.
Mhm.
And we don't realize just how bad it was for so many people. And subhanAllah, so all these people started calling me and they were like, I got your number from my friend. I hope you don't mind. I got your number from this person. I hope you don't mind. And I started doing like 5, 6 hours of counseling on the side. And I was still teaching. Things had moved online. It was, this was during the lockdown. And my husband overheard one of the calls and he was just like, wow, you're really good. And like, have you considered turning this into a side hustle? And I had never really thought about it until then, but then a whole like cascade of ideas started, developing. And first of all, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And secondly, I couldn't shut up about it with the people around me. Like, I want to do this and I want to do that. And and then, I got in touch with a couple of mentors and they sort of gave me some ideas and feedback, and then I was able to get started. Yeah, so we got married, I would say a couple of months after meeting, and we were definitely sold on each other, and we had all the important conversations about marital compatibility. But maybe one thing we didn't talk about enough that I wish we had talked about more in retrospect was how are we going to blend our families? And of course, we didn't, you can't talk about what you don't know, right? So we had no experience. All I knew is I really enjoyed watching my husband to be as a parent. I thought he was really fun, spontaneous, hands-on, and he still is. And he really enjoyed watching me as a parent. And by the way, all the single moms can relate to this. I was very structured. I had a lot of routines. My kids, were quite independent and helpful around the house. We had a very strict bedtime. So we were like both looking for things in the other person to complement our lives, but maybe we hadn't done these sort of intentional conversations that needed to happen. And now I help other women who have decided upon remarriage to do that. So we did all of those conversations after. So it was just like you get you're in the trenches. That's what we say. We were in the trenches together and we had to learn the hard way. What should our rules and principles be as a family? How are we going to blend our vision? We have some clear compatibilities in this area, and we have some incompatibilities. How are we going to reconcile these approaches? So it was a beautiful adventure. That's all I can say about it. One thing I will say though is like we both had this commitment, and if you're a family oriented person, you have to choose somebody who's family oriented because the thing is, you can't stop being family oriented. Like it's not something you can turn off. So alhamdulillah with him, I know he's family oriented and it's a large part of how we live our lives. And I told him about Stephen Covey's concept quite early, like of building a beautiful family culture. And he was completely on board with that. So that's what we've tried to do. And the joke we make is that we were better at building a beautiful family culture than building the marriage. Like we got so good at it. Our kids are they get along so well and they're so close to each other, alhamdulillah. And there's so much love and fun and subhanallah, like barakah in this home around the family that sometimes maybe then the marriage got a little bit neglected. But alhamdulillah for all of it. And I'm very, very grateful. And I genuinely love his children. And I know he genuinely loves mine. Right. Yesterday, he was in a completely different city, but drove back um, early to make it to my son's game, his stepson's game. And those are the sort of moments that, you feel like you've arrived somewhere after putting in a lot of hard work.
That's beautiful. We definitely
Um,
are going to be revisiting the topic of blended families and children later. Uh,
yeah,
Going back to your either your first marriage or your divorce, how would you describe your internal state at that time? Actually, your entire state, meaning emotionally, physically, spiritually. Yes.
I guess, you know, hindsight is the best teacher. If you had asked me that question a couple years ago, the answers would have been very different. Um, as I've grown more, reflected more, and really thought about it, what I think was going on for me in that first marriage was an ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually warns us about in the Quran in Surah Baqarah. And when you love people the way you should only love Allah. When you center people the way you should only center Allah. When you prioritize somebody in your heart the way that you should only be prioritizing Allah. So I think if I really reflect on my first marriage, it's a story of loving and centering another human being in a way that I never should have. And what I mean by that is I was regularly ignoring my intuition around certain things. I was regularly revolving around him, my in-laws, in ways that even anyone could see, and many people pointed out were harmful to me. Um, I was so, mired in people pleasing and trying to be the perfect wife and the perfect daughter-in-law. that I'd forgotten my purpose and why I'm really here on this earth. Like my whole life became about that and curating this like perfect little family, um, and putting enormous pressure on myself. And why? Now I wonder why, right? But at the time, like I can get into that younger woman's heart and understand like her intentions were good, but you never put people in that position. It's just not healthy. So of course, when you're constantly chasing someone and you've put them on a pedestal and everything in your life revolves around you, revolves around them, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get resentful and you're going to start losing touch with yourself, which is exactly what happened. We were married for 12, 13 years. Like, so it was a slow process. But at the end of it, I know I had a day like it almost felt like a movie where I looked in the mirror and I was like, I don't recognize myself. How did I get here? What am I doing exactly? What am I gaining here? And how do I get back to my essence? Like, how do I get back to waking up happy most days? And so that was a lot of what was going on. And, you know, you would never think it for somebody that on the surface, everything looks fine, right? It's not like we were toxic and abusive and all of that sort of stuff in the traditional sense, but it was um, it was the things that I think are so common in our, I'm Desi, I don't know about you, I'm Pakistani, in our culture that we think are love, and they're not. So, you know, just doing everything the way another person wants and thinking that absolute obedience is some kind of extension of your really religiosity and, you know, just pushing yourself more and more and more, having complete disregard for your own boundaries and your own mental health or your own priorities, and saying to yourself, well, I'm doing it for the sake of Allah, but really Allah never asked us to do that for another person. Allah doesn't ask us to lose ourselves for the sake of another person. So, you know, I want to really focus here on what I was doing. Of course, he was doing things that were wrong and harmful as well, but I don't think there's any power for me in looking at it from that perspective, because then I'm just blaming another person, and I certainly had a role to play in our dynamic.
Mm-hmm. So were you the one who pulled the plug?
I'm the one who said I can't do this anymore, and I did pull the plug in that sense. But after months of him telling me to come back, because I'd actually left Singapore, that's where we were. I'd come back to Canada to take time to think. And after months of telling me to come back, I just couldn't. I was like so anxious, and every fiber of me was telling me, don't go back. Don't go back this time. You know, and I'm not, I was a person who was doing like praying tahajjud every day at this point, making constant dua, so connected that every waking moment was the remembrance of Allah, dhikr on my tongue, dua in my heart. Like that's how my entire day was going. And something just kept telling me, don't go back. So I didn't. And I just waited and I asked Allah to do what's best for me, that I'm no longer going to fight against the outcome, but I'm going to accept his decree. And I'm going to accept it no matter what, because I clearly don't know what's best for me. I clearly am not good at making decisions for my life. Otherwise, I would not have ended up in this situation. So for him to just take over and to do what's best for me now moving forward.
Mm.
And for me to have the kind of tawakkul that a person only reads about, you know. And that was new because I'd never thought that way. Like when in a younger version of Islam, you associate Islam with like prayer and fasting and all these external sort of observances. And what I understood Islam to be now at that stage was um, really letting go and submitting, like emotionally, and putting your ego aside and really trying to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing for you in your life, and in what ways are you possibly resisting it. So I did let go, but then he's the one who officially filed for divorce. And when he did, I do remember feeling sadness, but also a sense of relief.
But as you mentioned, it was a very trying time. Can you tell
Yes.
us about picking up the pieces and developing resilience?
Wow, how much time do you have? I mean, it was if I talk about it now, it feels like this very neat and linear process, but it was anything but. I was a mess. I was completely shattered. Um, there were many, many times that I wondered if I'd made the right decision. What I tried to do throughout, which I think really helped me, was put Allah first. Another piece of advice that my father gave me that I think really helped me is, at that time I had a group of really close friends and I had a group of really close family members. And he told me the better thing for you to do would be to go silent for a little while and go inward and really just pour your thoughts onto the prayer mat and your feelings and your tears there. Because as much as people love you, no one's going to understand and give you what you need right now. And that really helped me because I followed his advice and I went inward. And that's when I started recognizing sort of my addiction to relationships as a whole. And what is that? And then I started realizing I need to develop a relationship with myself. You know, maybe all of this need to talk to others and the need for constant validation and the need for constant, like, here, please listen to my story and please cry with me. Like, what was that really? What was really going on for me? And it really struck me after a while and became clear after a while that I was running away from having a deep and close and connected relationship with myself. So that was quite profound. And when that happened, things changed. And I think that's what led to being able to build resilience is to understand that there's only two relationships that matter in this world. Your relationship with Allah and his messenger by extension, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and your relationship with yourself. And every other relationship is actually a reflection of those fundamental relationships. And I think when I understood that, that was just a game changer, right? I started investing in myself in ways that I'd never really done before with the kind of intention that I'd never had before. Like, this isn't a nice to have, this is a non-negotiable. I started understanding that there's goodness in heartbreak, which I'd heard before, but I never really internalized until I went through it. And I thought to myself, if I could recover and thrive after this, I can do anything. Like, I can be faced with any situation. I can overcome any sort of hardship because I have Allah and I'll be okay. And the confidence boost that gives a person, subhanAllah. And then also, like, to get into the nitty gritty, like knowing my family's got my back and being able to communicate to them what I needed from them rather than letting them dictate the terms of what that support would look like. Therapy helped a lot, being able to talk to someone in a safe space and really explore what was going on internally, after the initial couple of months. Journaling, because journaling gives you so much clarity into your own thought process. Like, so much of our feelings are shrouded from ourselves because we don't sit down and really sit with our feelings. And then I started really focusing on my physical health. Like, I understood that working out isn't just to get skinny, it's an investment in, you know, like, it's all connected. My body, my brain, my heart, it's all one holistic whole. And if I don't start taking care of myself, no one else is coming in to do it. So I really started investing in my sleep and my exercise and eating right. And like, that's still shocking to women when I tell them that how much of a game changer that is, because we tend to take on the Western view that these things are very separate, like the mind is here and the body is here. But I think if we start really seeing that they're an integrated whole and how one benefits the other, we can really, like, transform our lives, subhanAllah. What else? I would say a big part of building resilience was also just embracing authenticity, maybe for the first time, like just remembering who I am, and I'm pretty awesome. There's a lot of great things about me. Um, I've made mistakes, I have flaws, but I'm lovable and I'm worthy of a good life. And actually, I can be myself. And there's lots of people who will appreciate who I am exactly the way I am, who will welcome my boundaries, and who will, sort of love me despite my imperfections. Like they can see me fully and still be like, okay, I still choose you. And that was just so, I mean, it sounds so obvious now, but it was such a big deal at the time. And it was,
Not obvious. I think that's huge. That's huge. And I'm so moved just hearing it, honestly. Like it makes me emotional actually listening to you because I remember what that's like, that
yeah,
that post-divorce period where literally self-esteem is under the bus, shattered. And then the same words that you said, where you realize that you actually do have aspects of yourself that are good and sound and lovable. And yeah, so that's very powerful. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
very, it's very easy to forget that when you're in a marriage that's in decline. Like, if we're honest with ourselves, we know when our marriages are headed for divorce. Most of us. Sometimes people are blindsided, but most marriages end slowly. And we start, a lot of women blame themselves, right? And I was one of those people. I fully blame myself. And although I was like intellectually aware of the toxic behavior he was bringing to the table, the pressure I'd put on myself is, as a woman, it's my job to hold this marriage together. And as a woman, it's my job to make sure this marriage works. And if the marriage doesn't work, then of course the woman is to blame. The woman has the responsibility of being the patient one, and the one who puts up with things that are less than desirable, and the one who makes sacrifices. And if women stop doing that, no marriage would work. And this is like that cultural conditioning that I'd grown up with. Um, so now, of course, I've heard that story so many times that I know how common it is, but it felt very unique to me at that time. Like all these scripts I'd been following unconsciously. Um, of course, we also know, like, when you keep sacrificing for somebody, they don't turn around and say, "Oh my God, I appreciate you so much. You've done A, B, and C for me, so now I'm gonna let you off the hook for D, E, and F. I'm gonna stop expecting you to sacrifice. I'm gonna turn around and give you what you want." That's not what happens. When people get used to us being so sacrificial, they will keep expecting us to be sacrificial. And anytime you stand up for or advocate for yourself, it's like, well, who are you to say anything? Like you've always been the one who sacrifices, and you need to continue that role. And people get very comfortable with that. So the other understanding here was just like, I can never be in a situation like this again. Like I made a promise to myself. I'm never going to be in a relationship that feels one-sided on any level. And if I don't feel warm, genuine reciprocity, then even in friendship, even in family relationships, I'm not just talking about romantically, I'm not going to partake in that in the long term.
Mhm.
I'm either going to try to change the dynamic of the relationship, or I'm going to withdraw from the relationship, because this is not healthy. It's not healthy to abandon yourself. So that, and then of course, the most beautiful part of building resilience is helping other people. So sort of to go full circle back to where we started, starting the divorce support group with the intention, and I think it was like a year after the divorce. I remember saying to Allah, "Oh Allah, you brought me through this, and I never would have imagined that I'd go through this. And I never would have imagined that I'd be here sitting on the other side of it, actually grateful for the entire experience. And now I want to help other people that are in situations like I was. And I want to be able to do that for your sake. So please accept it from me, and bring the right women to me." I remember making that dua as well. And then it just sort of took off. And I was really sad when I had to stop that work. But I understood, like, with the challenges of a new marriage, moving cities, starting a new job, blending a family, I'm just not going to be able to continue it. But, you know, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought me back to it further down the road, which I never would have guessed or imagined. Alhamdulillah.
So I know you said that your healing process wasn't linear, but would you say that approximately took you about a year where you felt, yeah, I think I'm good right now. I'm much better. I'm ready to move on.
I would say, and I say this to my clients all the time, I say, I don't think you're going to feel normal for about 2 years. So I would add another year to that. And
Mm.
I advise women not to get remarried in those 2 years, to just really go inward and um, sort of remember who they are, reclaim who they are, heal independently, get strong, and not jump into the next relationship before you're ready.
So
Because I do see women do that all the time, and it's the consequences are really unfortunate, right? Especially when there's children.
when it comes to remarriage, people say that you should only move on and remarry when you are healed. My question is that do you think that full healing is actually possible? Aren't people always in constant adjustment and change and improving all the time? And to tie that into your situation, how did you know that you were ready to remarry? And
Mm.
how did you meet your spouse?
Okay, so truth be told, I didn't know I was ready to get remarried. Okay. And of course, I had some pressure from the family to start talking to people, meeting people. And I remember I remember feeling very scared. And I remember feeling very put off by initial conversations. Like, you know, when you do self-work, you can spot red flags a mile away. And so I was engaged in this heavy self-work. And if I got even a whiff of um, this attitude in particular that, oh, well, you're divorced and that means you're damaged goods and you should consider it a favor, I'm even talking to you, which a lot of men demonstrate, unfortunately. Um, if I got even a whiff of that, I was out. So this might be too much information, but me and my sister-in-law had a system, and she's one of my closest friends, where, you know, I would go and meet somebody for coffee or for dinner, and 20 minutes in, just like the movie, she would call with an emergency. And if I was okay, I would just pretend like it's not an emergency and be fine. But if I wasn't, that gave me an exit plan. And I left. And I wouldn't have done that. Like earlier in my life, I would have felt that being a nice person means you stay till the end. And being a nice person means you listen fully to somebody and make them feel good about themselves, no matter how you're feeling, no matter how uncomfortable you are. The focus should be on how the other person feels and their experience. And even like that for me was such a small and sort of revolutionary act of loving myself and putting myself first, right? Because within 20 minutes, you kind of know. And here's the clincher. Nobody made it past 20 minutes until my husband. SubhanAllah. And so um, the first time I sat down and I agreed to, we were introduced by friends. And the first time I sat and really talked to my husband, we ended up talking for 6 hours. And by the second time we met, I was driving home from meeting him and talking to one of my friends. And I told her, I think I'm going to end up marrying this guy. And she told that story at the wedding, by the way, which was very embarrassing for me. But um, I, you just know sometimes. And I'm not saying that it's perfect between us. It's certainly not. But I don't need it to be. I'm okay because my orientation is no longer on this hyper fixation on the marriage. My fixation is now on Allah and myself. And there's parts of my life that the marriage fulfills, of course. How could it not? But there's parts of my life that have nothing to do with my husband. Like this morning, I posted on Instagram that one of my soulmates is a close female friend. And if you had asked me 10 years ago, I never would have thought to put the words soulmate and friend together. But I do now recognize that of the people, like a very small group of people that I consider soulmates in this world, she's one of them. And so that's a very different way of approaching marriage. Whereas before, growing up with Hollywood and Bollywood and all these sort of romantic conceptions, my whole life and mind and thought process, and I can't even tell you, my entire heart space was revolved around this idea of having the perfect marriage. And I recognize that now. And so I was chronically trying to have that. And I was chronically obsessed with trying to have that. And I felt like that is my life's mission. And it seems so ridiculous now in retrospect, you know, because historically, that's not what marriage ever was. So part of this is our cultural conditioning as well of the last 100 years, you know, all these messages we've internalized from the movies we've watched and consumed and all of that, like that, you know, your soulmate is a man and he's coming to rescue you. And once he finds you, you live happily ever after. You know, quite the opposite. Marriage is hard work. And no one's coming to sweep you off your feet. You're going to sit down and you're going to, you know, like I said, be in the trenches together. And is this the person you want to be in the trenches with? And you're going to be up at 3 a.m. cleaning vomit. And you're gonna be, you know what I mean? Like it's a completely, real life is completely different. And it might not be that you're compatible in every single way, but we're compatible on A, B, and C. And man, those things really matter to me. And those are some of my core values. But when I need D, I'm gonna go to this friend. And when I need E, I have my sister for that. You know what I mean? So a much more like a rich tapestry of relationships around you and not just thinking and putting all your eggs in one basket. And that's just maturity and wisdom. And you know, alhamdulillah, actually the shattering of the first marriage is what shifted my perspective about that. So it was very instructive in the end.
So apart from that aspect, how else would you say that Saadia in marriage number one differs from Saadia in marriage number two?
Yeah. So Allah first. That's the biggest thing in practice and in my heart. And also just I'm much more aware of what I want. Everything is being done with much more intentionality and not just following the blueprints that were available to me. So I never say things like, but that's how my sister and her husband operate, or that's what I saw my parents doing. It's irrelevant. We're two new people with two completely unique backgrounds and perspectives, and our marriage has to make sense in our context, not according to what makes sense for a friend or a sister or a mom. And that requires self-knowledge. Like at the end of the day, mashallah, my mom has a great marriage, my sister has a great marriage. But at the end of the day, I'm a unique person and I'm not going to have the marriages exactly that they have. So what kind of marriage do I want to have? Understanding what my core values are, understanding what my needs are. And then after doing that work, being able to communicate that to another person calmly, rationally, step by step, with boundaries in place. I mean, it's revolutionary, really, because we're not taught to do these things growing up. A lot of the women I talk to are like, I don't even know why I'm upset. You know, and then it takes work for us to get to the root of what's hurting them or the root of what's making them angry. Like we are so disconnected from our own emotions and so disconnected from our own intuition, which like to me is our desi good. And I know other cultures have it too. Like a lot of Arab women talk to me, a lot of women from the Somalian community talk to me. So it's the same thing across different cultures. But the idea is like when we're young, as girls especially, we're taught to be pleasant all the time. And if we ever go through sadness or anger, we are told to suppress those feelings because those aren't convenient. So what happens is you stop trusting those feelings in yourself. You start every time you feel angry, you are like, but I shouldn't feel this way. But I know I have so much to be grateful about. But I know although this is a problem, but he does this. You know what I mean? And it's like we would rather like play all these mental games to excuse the behavior of another person rather than being like, this is making me upset and I have every right to be upset about this. And now the question is, what am I going to do about it? And first of all, am I willing to communicate that to another person? Because they don't understand everything going on in my head, right? So it's like the willingness, the courage to step into your own discomfort and to be like, hey, that thing you said, it kind of bothered me. You know, that remark you made, it really hurt my feelings, you know. And then being married to somebody mature enough who responds, oh my God, I didn't realize. And instead of getting defensive, you know, I didn't realize, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. How did it hurt your feelings exactly? And then you're like, well, it reminded me of this time when I was in grade 6, and you go into the backstory. Well, that requires the conversation with yourself first, right? So I think like the key for all of that was just to really get into a deeper self-awareness, which unfortunately I didn't have for so many years because I was really living a life that was disconnected from my own intuition. And in any time uncomfortable feelings would crop up, I would tell myself, no, 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 shut up about that. Like, just that's not an issue. You need to just shut up. So when I'm doing that sort of censoring internally, how seriously is another person going to treat my feelings? Like if I don't take myself seriously, how can I expect somebody else to?
I do want to say something on that though. I 100% hear you, how many women, they almost devalidate, if there's a word like that, unvalidate their own emotions,
Invalidate, yeah.
invalidate their own emotions.
Yeah.
However, what I'm also wary of, I'm very wary of, is also enabling women who actually have like an emotional psychological issue. For example, some women, they are almost entrenched in self-pity or negative thinking. That's almost their default. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that. You know what I'm saying? Like a person who might, for example, come from a dysfunctional background, or they themselves are being narcissistic. And so, oh, well, he never listens to me. He's such a jerk. Whatever. When actually, you might be the problem. If you would like to,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. So I hear you completely on that. Unfortunately, the way the culture has shifted, I see it a lot in young people. And I think I know why. The culture now is very me, me, me. And it's very narcissistic, like just generally, like all of us. We have collective ADHD and we have collective narcissism. So that's why I do like everything I said. I would add the added component here that we have to do it with Allah at the center. Okay. So the second that, and I have to know the difference. So the second someone's violating my rights, I have to be clear about that. But if they're fulfilling my rights, and this is just a matter of ego, of me trying to get my way, of me, you know, trying to manipulate a situation, and I know that I can through tears or the use of certain words that, you know, have become very popularized into mainstream discourse, then I have to catch that in myself. And I think we all have that tendency. But I completely hear you, and I do see that as a problem as well, 100%. Um, and now it's just a matter of like everybody comes from their own unique perspective. And I hope every single woman has at least one person in their life who can give them raw and honest feedback. Because
Unbiased of this.
yeah, and at least one person that is willing to tell you the truth. Um, but having said that, like I think we're all toxic in small ways. Even the most healed, most evolved, most like Zen type person you can imagine has their toxic traits. So knowing that is great. Like, why wouldn't it be great to have awareness and knowledge of that so that you're constantly working on it? Um, and that's the key too, is like there's one type of person who will say, well, that's just the way I am, deal with it. And there's a second type of person, and that to me is the Allah centered person who says, I know I have this and I'm working on it. You know, and that the root there is not ego, but humility. I know I have this, but I definitely need to address it. And then to also recognize that whoever you marry, comes with their own toxic traits, their own unhealed traumas and wounds and shadow. And then you're like, am I willing to take on this person's particular traumatic bent? You know what I mean? Because there's no person that doesn't have it. Am I willing to take on this person's toxic history and toxic patterns um, for the sake of what we're trying to build together? Right? And that depends on you, right? That's a very subjective conversation. Like one woman might be willing to tolerate certain things that another woman wouldn't be willing to tolerate. So that very much depends on the individual. But then of course you're not compatible. If you're not willing to make space for your husband's toxicities, then you're not compatible. And that's okay. You can send that person along and you can try to find somebody else, inshallah. I mean, nobody's perfect. I will say this, when I'm engaged in some marital counseling here in the city I live. It's a suburb of Toronto. And I noticed that there's a pattern in the marriages where people end up staying together versus the marriages where people end up getting a divorce. And it's not what you would think. It's not, a lot of marriages have betrayal, and a lot of marriages have a lot of deeply disturbing, even abusive things going on. And it's shocking sometimes. You're sitting there and you're trying to like keep a neutral expression and you're listening to people talk about things in a normalized fashion that you know are not normal. But here's the difference between the marriages that work out and the ones that don't. In the marriages that work out, you have two people who are willing to say, I need to work on that. You know, all of this is happening, but I want to change. I want to be better. There's like an orientation towards growth in both partners. But in marriages where one person's like, everything is his fault or everything is her fault, number one. And number two, I don't need to change. He needs to change. I don't need to change. She needs to change. That marriage doesn't last. So even the worst marriages you can imagine, like I'm thinking like serial cheaters and things like that, like these people are able to somehow recover when there's that humble moment of acceptance, acknowledgement, and desire for growth. And, you know, I've checked in with people after a couple of years and they're like, things are completely different now. You know, we're happy, we're thriving, everything's fine. He got therapy, she got help. You know, like there's just a different mood, even from the first meeting, between people who are willing to change, are willing to own up to what they bring to the table, versus people who are simply not interested in examining themselves.
Mm-hmm. Saadia, can you talk about this concept of not giving your heart fully to someone? Because that sometimes it's, as you said, given the media exposure we've had, it almost seems kind of impossible that how can one be in a marriage, a relationship with the most intimate person in your life and not give them all of your heart? What does that mean, really?
I mean, I learned that the hard way, but I think um, you should never be completely out of your power. You know what I'm trying to say? Like you should, every decision should be intentional and every decision should be an empowered decision. And even when you are making a sacrifice, you're doing it from a place of strength rather than a place of resentment or rather than a place of compulsion. And I really had to study the women around the messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to understand this. When we look at our role models, these were strong women. They were not pushovers. And so they demonstrated femininity and they demonstrated softness, but they knew where their husband ends and they begin. And they knew their rights and they knew their obligations and they knew how to stand up for themselves. And these are our role models, right? We tend to gloss over some of these fierce moments, or somehow they haven't been taught to us, these fierce moments in the history of Muslim women, the early history of Muslim women, what kinds of things they were engaged in, what kind of advocacy they, you know, went into the community with. And it's documented in the Quran, by the way, right? Like right off the top of my head, I'm thinking of the story of Khawla, where her husband said something to her, which she found offensive, and she went straight to the Prophet and said, I need a decision about this. And then Allah Himself answered her in a way that would last for the rest of time. And the message is, you cannot violate people, even in private. You can't violate basic rights. And every word you utter, Allah is witness. What a great message for all of us to internalize. But like, it really puts it into perspective in the context of marriage. How many of us, myself included, have said things that we would never say to another person? We would never dream to a colleague, to a friend, to a family member, but we say them to our spouse. And Allah makes it so clear right there. Oh, you better watch the way you talk to each other, because I am witness to all of it, right? That is the height of taqwa, to really be conscious of God in those moments where you are like completely charged up, angry. That person gets under your skin like no one else on earth. But so that's what I mean also by like not giving away your heart fully, because the the role and responsibility of emotional self-regulation continues even in the context of a marriage. It's not like you are emotionally regulated in every other aspect of your life, and then you come home and you can just turn that part off, and now you're a monster towards your family. And we see that all the time, right? You have to be even more careful around your husband. You have to be even more careful around your children, because the best of you is the best towards their family, right? That's the Prophet's words, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not mine. And that's where the measure of who you really are comes into play. Like, you can fake it at work, and you can fake it at the masjid, and you can fake it with your friends. You can't fake who you are with the people you live with. You are who you are, and sooner or later, they're going to see exactly who you are. And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects the most from us. So that also means my heart is not completely just, oh, this is my husband, so I can just be myself. No, my heart is first and foremost oriented towards God. God is witnessing every moment between us. How can I show up in the best possible way, whether in good times or in times of hardship or conflict, or times that I feel tested by this marriage? That is a completely different way of orienting yourself than most, like certainly than the Western model of marriage, right? Where this person is your person and you can be yourself and blah, blah, blah. I don't believe in that. And so that does require you to hold pieces of yourself back, because maybe the first thing I want to say is, not appropriate. So I have to go and check in with myself, and I have to be like, okay, what's the right way to approach this? What's the strategic way to approach this? How can I frame this more gently for him? I can see he's struggling, but, and vice versa, you know, does that mean we never have outbursts? Of course not. Of course we have outbursts, but then we're quickly able to go back to the default and check in with ourselves and be like, oh my God, I spoke to you in a completely inappropriate way. I'm so sorry. That wasn't okay. Can we start again? Because now I have a standard. And the standard has to come from our religion, I think, because every other standard is slippery. It's not a strong foundation.